In our All-Star Roundtable this week, Dale Butland, Communications Director for Innovation Ohio, a progressive think tank. And joining us for the very first time, Jean Krebs. Jean is the Senior Director of Government Affairs and Policy for Greater Ohio Policy Center. Welcome to both of you. We've been talking so much about the credit downgrade, the infighting in Washington over the economy, whether or not we were going to reach the debt ceiling. As we take a deep breath and look back at this, were there any political winners or losers that you can point to after all of this?
Well, I would say that there were no winners in this. As a matter of fact, there's a bunch of new polls that came out just this week that I was looking at just before we came here to the studio. There are no winners, but I think it's fair to say that the Republicans were the biggest losers. There are three polls. One is a CBS New York Times poll that shows a 72% disapproval rating for Republicans. CNN found a Republican unfavorable rating at an all-time high. And CNN said the same thing. The Tea Party, the bottom has fallen out for the Tea Party. That poll I was just mentioning to you, the CNN poll, found the Tea Party approvals at 18%. It has fallen off a cliff. I think the danger for the Republicans is that because the Tea Party is driving a lot of what they're doing in Washington, the danger for them is that they look extreme. When the public says we want to see a balanced approach to deficit reduction, including revenues as well as cuts, and the GOP says no, they look extreme. When the public says that we want to end the subsidies for oil companies, GOP says no, they look extreme. When the vast majority of people say that they want compromise, and the GOP says no way, they look extreme. So that's a danger for them, and I think they need to stop letting the Tea Party call the shots.
I think you could say, though, do you think the Democrats came out winners here? Gene, what are your thoughts on all of this? I don't think anybody came out on top.
I think what Bobby and Betty Buckeye are wanting, they're wanting to fix the problem and stop trying to fix the blame. Mm-hmm. And I think that when you see significant legislation pass through, the theory I've always held is I call it the 85-50-1 rule. And that is the majority party of the majority caucus gets 85% of their members to vote yes. Half of the minority party of that chamber votes yes. And then you get the one signature by the president to make it happen. The Debt Reduction Act, while in many ways it was a clumsy exercise to get there, an ugly exercise to get there, it satisfied the 85-50-1 rule. And I think you have to give a huge amount of credit, at least internally, to Speaker John Boehner, who took a very fractious caucus, and he led them in a manner that was driven by consensus, driven by not punishment. He took away pork as a way to go ahead and reward and or punish people. Nobody's lost their committee chairmanships over this. And I think if you've known John Boehner for 20 years, this is very consistent with what he would like to do, I think. So I think he came out the winner of everybody in Congress at this point in time.
I agree that John Boehner has done a good job, and he was a pretty reasonable guy, but what happened in this deficit reduction thing goes back to what I just said a moment ago. John Boehner and President Obama got into a room, and they agreed amongst themselves for a $4 trillion worth of deficit reduction. $3 of spending cuts for every $1 revenue. Boehner signed on to it, but he couldn't get it through his caucus in the House because there's about 60 Tea Party members there who said no way.
And what I'm hearing from people on the streets, just the average Joe, they are so tired of the infighting. And, you know, there used to be this sense that if you made it to Congress, you were a diplomat, that you went and you worked with your colleagues on both sides of the aisle and you tried to do what was best for the country. No one thinks they're doing what's best for the country. They think they're doing what's best for their parties. And I think people are so disenchanted. Why can't we get back to diplomacy and compromise?
I'm speaking here now as a recovering politician. And
Member of a 12-step program?
Yes, a 12-step program, yes. We meet, yeah. In any case, I think what part of it deals with is, ironically, we now have very inexpensive airline fares. And so the congressmen and women now fly back to the districts every week. If you want to have a conversation with Congressman Pat Tiberi, there's a couple particular flights he's always flying out of at Columbus Airport at 7:30 in the morning. Okay, you can catch him there every time. And because of that, they no longer stay there. They used to be, they would move there, and their families would be. They go to the same church. Their kids would go to the same school. They see each other at baseball practice. None of that occurs anymore. And, had this whole thing of now they're just strangers.
Do you think that there's a path back to compromise? Do you think that because I don't think anybody's trying to find it.
Yeah, well, I think it's born of a number of things. I think Gene has put his finger on some of it, and that is there isn't this sort of collegiality anymore that there used to be back in the old days when I worked in the Senate, and I was there for 20 years. But the polarization that has occurred in our politics as well as our country has been just debilitating. Compromise is the lifeblood of democracy. The Founding Fathers set it up that way. It's the only way that a system like ours can work because of divided power and checks and balances. It's very different from a parliamentary system where one party wins, they control all the levers of power, they get to implement their program, voters then get to choose whether to keep them in office or to throw the bums out, bring in some new people, and to start over again. That's not the kind of system we have, so it depends on compromise. But the polarization, part of it has to do with the way we redistrict legislative lines. I know that seems far afield, but it's not.
No, it's not.
Because when you can do these districts so that they're overwhelmingly Republican or overwhelmingly Democratic, there is no reason for the people representing those districts to compromise. As a matter of fact, there's a danger if they do, because they can be challenged in a primary by a right-wing Republican if you're a Republican or a left-wing Democrat if you're a Democrat. So that's one thing that has to change. The Senate, where I spent my time in Washington, is completely dysfunctional now. Now it takes 60 votes to pass anything. I was telling Gene before this show, I was looking up some stats. The filibuster, which is not part of the Constitution, by the way, that's a Senate practice. The filibuster was used from 1950 until recently, roughly once every 10 years. Last year, the Republicans used it to filibuster 80% of the major legislation that came before that body. As a result, you have gridlock. You have to have a supermajority to pass anything. That's not the way the Founding Fathers intended it.
One of the things they're doing right now out in California, and they've done it in some few other states, is they do a nonpartisan primary. The top two, regardless of party affiliation, move on to the general election.
So they may be two Democrats, two Republicans, two Tea Party members. You don't know.
But what it does is that the theory in the political science universe is that this is going to drive the candidates back to more of a middle, so they want to appeal to a larger bell curve distribution of voters. That's the theory. We'll find out.
And along with that, since we're in the process of redrawing the district lines right now, or soon will be,
right.
If we could construct these district lines so as much as possible there was an even number of Democrats and Republicans in these districts, all of a sudden the whole dynamic changes. Because now if you're a Democrat, you know you have to get some Republican votes to win. If you're a Republican, you got to get some Democratic votes. That's the way to solve a lot of this.
I also want to ask you before we wrap up today, John Kasich made some statements that, Ohio has a AAA rating right now. America does not. It has a 2-star rating. Should America be modeling itself after Ohio, which is what he is suggesting, or what do we do to pull ourselves out of this problem?
Well, actually, I took the time to go back and actually read the Standard & Poor's report on the upgrade for Ohio. And although I know Governor Kasich likes to take credit and say, well, it was because of his policies, actually it had nothing to do with his policies. It had to do with the fact that revenues had increased in Ohio because of the economic recovery that had started before he ever took office. And indeed, the Kasich budget is only balanced if their prediction that we'll have economic growth and recovery over the next 2 years comes true. If it doesn't, it's not balanced. We're back in a billion-dollar hole again. So you ask what has to be done for the economy generally. This is my view. We have to have a jobs program. We have massive unemployment that's not getting better because there's no demand. There's no consumer demand. Consumers are 70% of our economy. There's no consumer demand because of unemployment, because people have debt, because
it's like a catch-22, though.
It's a catch-22. You got to get people spending again and buying products. Businesses are sitting on $2 to $3 trillion that they're not investing and they're not hiring with because nobody will buy their products.
Yeah. Going back to the governor, there's 50 governors. 40 of them are engaged in what I would call transformational leadership, both R's and D's. On both sides of the aisle. And I think that when I look around the country, the Democrat governor who reminds me to certain degrees about John Kasich is Mario Cuomo.
Yeah, I've heard other people say that.
And it's because, different styles, but you talk about transformation, and whenever if all you're ever going to do is defend and enhance the status quo is going to say, way to go. But when you engage in transformation, you start to upset the status quo. That's when you're going to see some change. And I look at there's a collection of Republican and Democrat governors around the country who are trying to change their state structure, and everybody's structured differently, into something else. I have to give them all some creds. Some of them are failures, let's face it, but some of them are trying to move their state together in a different manner.
There's one thing we need for economic growth, and you're absolutely right. That's the key to the future. If there's one thing you need, it's a well-educated workforce.
Right.
And my concern is by cutting $3 billion out of education, it's exactly the wrong way to go about it.
One thing we also cannot change is the clock on the wall, and we are out of time. We thank you both for being with us, and we will be right back. Next week on The Spectrum, we'll be keeping an eye on Wall Street and a closer eye on Washington and the State House, and of course our All-Star Roundtable on NBC4's The Spectrum. Hope you can join us then.